pure experiences.
Welcome to the Pure Experiences Podcasts.
In today's book reading session, I'm going to start a new book which is called Pointers from Nisargadatta Maharaj by Ramesh Balsekar. As many of you must be knowing that Nisargadatta Maharaj was a spiritual master on the path of knowledge or the direct path. He belonged to the well-known Nath tradition, specifically to the Inchgiri sect of Nath tradition. And the lineage goes back to the famous composer of Avadhut Gita, Dattatreya himself. This book was published in 1982 by the Akan Press, United States of America. Nisargadatta diverted considerably from his tradition and adopted more Advait-centric approach, that of questions and answers, which is the Gyan-marg. And his disciples were mostly foreigners, with few Indians also, and Balsekar was one of them. And in this book, he has used his own understanding of Nisargadatta Maharaj's teachings. This book is about the teachings of Maharaj as understood and absorbed by Ramesh Balsekar. I'm not going to read whole of the book, although it is very tiny book, only 145 pages. But I'm going to read from some sections, and I'm going to comment whenever there is a need to comment. So let us start with Preface. I had no intention of writing a book on the teaching of Sri Nisargadatta Maharaj. The material that appears in this volume emerged spontaneously, dictated in a fine frenzy that surcharged my being by a compulsive power that could not be denied. There was no alternative but to write, to reduce to a verbal level the abstract comprehension of the master's words. Actually, it was more like listening than writing, though my pen apparently formed words and sentences on the paper before me. When the first piece, now a chapter in this book, was written, I found that my thoughts were running way ahead of the writing, and what I wrote was put away in a folder without even being read over again. I did not then expect that there would be more of such writing, let alone as many as 50-odd pieces. Each time there would be this feeling of compulsion to put in writing a particular topic which Maharaj might have dealt with, and each time the article was put away in the folder without being revised or even read over. When about 15 articles had been so collected, a friend of mine, K.K. Bansha of Hong Kong, an ardent fellow devotee, happened to call at my residence. While we were discussing a particular point, I happened to mention that some writing had come about on that very subject only the previous day. Of course, Keiki, keen as ever, would not let me slip out of what had already been said, and was insistent that he be allowed to read the article. Then, of course, he had to read the others too. He then arranged to have them typed with one copy for himself, of course. At this time, I found myself in a real predicament because I had not mentioned to Maharaj anything about these intuitive writings. In fact, I had not said anything about this to anyone, not even to my particular friend and colleague, Soumitra Mullar Patan, who had been doing the translating of Maharaj's talks long before I also was asked by Maharaj to do so. By the time I told Mullar Patan about the intuitive writing and my predicament, the number had increased to about 25. Inspiration for writing seemed to come at irregular intervals of time. I would compulsively dash off 5 or 6 pieces at a time, and then nothing for a few days. One morning, after the usual session, Mullah Arpatan and I were taking Maharaj out for a drive in the car, when suddenly Mullah Arpatan brought up the matter of these articles. He was, like me, aware of the fact that Maharaj generally discouraged his devotees from writing or lecturing on his teaching, presumably for 2 reasons. A. The writer concerned might have understood the subject not deeply enough, or he might have understood it only superficially, or might not have really understood it at all. And B. It might tempt him to establish himself as a pseudo-guru and do considerable damage all round. So, Mullah Arpatan went about it tactfully, bringing out very clearly that the entire writing was essentially spontaneous. And it was not as if I had deliberately sat at a desk with pen and paper to write on specific subjects, and that the very speed with which the words had come pouring out on paper showed that the writing was not contrived. I was sitting in the front seat of the car, and Maharaj and Mullah Arpatan were in the rear. While Mullah Arpatan was saying all this, there was no vocal reaction of any sort from Maharaj, not a sound. So, with considerable trepidation, I turned round to have a look and found Maharaj completely relaxed, leaning back in the seat, his eyes closed and the most beatific smile on his lips. The message was clear. He already knew about the articles. He had to know. What is more, he was pleased. When Mullah Arpatan finished, Maharaj sat up and said, "Let the articles continue, as many of them as would emerge by themselves. The essential point is spontaneity. Don't persist and don't resist." At this point, Mullah Arpatan suggested that the articles be published, and I put in that they could go under a pseudonym because I was very much aware that I was only an instrument for this writing. Maharaj at once agreed that they should be published, but insisted that the author's name must be clearly mentioned, although, he added, "I know that you both are aware that all writing originates in consciousness. There is writing, but no author." It was a tremendous relief for me that Maharaj now not only knew all about the writing, but was greatly pleased about it and had blessed it. Contents of the book. Number 1. The renderings of Maharaj's teaching in this book are not reproductions from recorded proceedings of the dialogue sessions. 2. They are essentially subjects discussed at the sessions, either when Mullah Arpatan had done the translating and I was present, or when I had done the translating myself. 3. The subject in each chapter has been dealt with in a greater depth than would be the case if merely literal English translation of Maharaj's Marathi words at any one session were given, whilst a substantial portion of a chapter would be what was discussed at a particular session. Further material to make the points clearer and more complete had to be drawn from other sessions when the same subject had been dealt with. Without this liberty, the subject would have lacked the depth which it is hoped it now contains. I am now going to skip the rest of the preface. It was written by Ramesh Balsekar, Bombay, February 1982. So something interesting appears in the preface that the writings were almost spontaneous. It came when most of the teaching of Maharaj was absorbed by Balsekar, and then he got this inspiration to write it down in his own language. They are not recordings of Nisargadatta Maharaj is talking. Although we see some of the dialogue in the book, but then other content of the book is Balsekar's own language. Now I'm going to skip the editor's note also and go to the content. There are about 57 short articles. Some are only 1 or 2 page long. I'm going to pick and choose some of the articles. So let us start with the first one, which is titled Pride of Achievement. I have worked hard and I now consider myself a very successful man. I would be a hypocrite if I did not admit that I have a considerable amount of satisfaction and yes, a certain amount of pride too in my achievement. Would that be wrong? One evening, a foreign visitor addressed Sri Nisargadatta Maharaj with these words. He was in his mid-40s, smug, self-confident, and a bit aggressive. Conversation then proceeded along the following lines. Maharaj, before we consider what is right and what is wrong, please tell me who is asking this question. A visitor, a bit startled. Why, me, of course. Maharaj, and who is that? Me, this me, who is sitting in front of you. And you think that that is you? You see me, I see myself. Where is the doubt? M. You mean this object that is before me. What is your earliest recollection of this object that you think you are? Think as far as you can. Visitor, after a minute or two. The earliest recollection would perhaps be of being caressed and cuddled by my mother. Maharaj, you mean as a tiny infant. Would you say that the successful man of today is the same helpless infant? Or is it someone else? And visitor, it is undoubtedly the same. Maharaj, good. Now, if you think further back, would you agree that this infant, which you can recollect, is the same baby that was born to your mother, that was once too helpless even to realize what was happening when its little body was going through its natural physical functions and could only cry when it was hungry or in pain? Visitor, yes, I was that baby, Maharaj. And before the baby acquired its body and was delivered, what were you? Visitor, I don't understand. Maharaj, you do understand. Think, what happened in your mother's womb? What was developing into a body with bones, blood, marrow, muscles, etc. over a period of 9 months? Was it not a male sperm cell that combined with ovum in the female womb, thus beginning a new life, and in the process going through numerous hazards? Who guarded this new life during this period of hazards? Is it not that very infinitesimally tiny sperm cell which is now so proud of his achievements? And who asked particularly for you? Your mother, your father? Did they particularly want you for a son? Did you have anything to do with being born to these particular parents? Visitor, I am afraid I really haven't thought along these lines. Maharaj, exactly. Do think along these lines. Then perhaps you will have some idea of your true identity. Thereafter, consider if you could possibly be proud of what you have achieved. Visitor, I think I began to understand what you are driving at. Maharaj, if you go deeper into the matter, you will realize that the source of the body, the male sperm and the female ovum, is in itself the essence of food consumed by the parents. Then the physical form is made up of and fed by the 5 elements constituting the food, and also that quite often the body of one creature does become the food for another creature. Visitor, but surely I as such must be something other than this food body. Maharaj, indeed you are, but not something. Find out what it is that gives sentience to a sentient being, that without which you would not even know that you exist. let alone the world outside, and finally go deeper yet and examine if this beingness, this consciousness itself is not time-bound. Visitor, I shall certainly go into the various questions you have raised, although I must confess that I have never explored these areas before, and I feel almost giddy in my ignorance of the new spheres you have opened up before me. I will come and see you again, Sir. Maharaj, you are always welcome. My comment here is that this is a very short dialogue between one visitor and Maharaj himself, and this should give us a little bit of idea about how he answered the questions, how he put the asker directly on the right track. Here he has taken the attention of the visitor to his own ignorance. Although he did not supply the answer, he has brought the visitor to a state of, I don't know, and the visitor faced his own ignorance. The ignorance here is obviously accepting this body as his essence without ever questioning it. So this was the first chapter, and we'll now jump to the second one, which is titled Consciousness, the Only Capital. Maharaj often comes out with the statement that consciousness is the only capital that a sentient being is born with. This, he says, is the apparent position. The real situation, however, is that what is born is consciousness, which needs an organism to manifest itself in, and that organism is the physical body. What is it that gives sentience, capacity to feel sensations, to respond to stimuli, to a sentient being? What is it that distinguishes a person who is alive from the one who is dead? It is, of course, the sense of being, the knowledge of being present, consciousness, the activizing spirit which animates the physical construct of the body. It is consciousness indeed that manifests itself in individual forms and gives them apparent existence. In human beings, through such manifestation arises the concept of a separate I. In such individual, the absolute gets reflected as awareness, and thus pure awareness becomes self-awareness or consciousness. The objective universe is in continuous flux, constantly projecting and dissolving innumerable forms. Whenever a form is created and is infused with life, that is prana, consciousness, that is chetna, appears simultaneously and automatically by the reflection of the absolute awareness in matter. Consciousness, it must be clearly understood, is a reflection of the absolute against the surface of matter, bringing about a sense of duality. As different from it, pure awareness, the absolute state, is without beginning and end, without the need of any support other than itself. Awareness becomes consciousness only when it has an object to reflect against. Between pure awareness and awareness reflected as consciousness, says Maharaj, there is a gap which the mind cannot cross. Reflection of the sun in a drop of dew is not the sun. Manifested consciousness is time-bound, inasmuch as it disappears as soon as the physical construct it inhabits comes to an end. Nevertheless, according to Maharaj, it is the only capital a sentient being is born with, and manifested consciousness being his only connection with the Absolute. It becomes the only instrument by which the sentient being can hope to get an illusory liberation from the individual he believes himself to be. By being one with his consciousness and treating it as his Atma, his God, he can hope to attain what he thinks as the unattainable. What is the actual substance of this animating consciousness? Obviously, it must be physical material, because in absence of the physical form, it cannot survive. Manifested consciousness can exist only as long as its abode, the body, is kept in a sound and habitable condition. Although consciousness is a reflection of the Absolute, it is time-bound, can be sustained only by the food material, comprising the 5 elements that the physical body is. Consciousness resides in a healthy body and abandons it when it is decayed and moribund. Reflection of the sun can be seen only in a clear dewdrop, not in a muddy one. Maharaj often says that we can observe the nature and function of consciousness in our daily routine of sleeping, dreaming, and waking states. In deep sleep, consciousness retires into a state of repose, as it were. When consciousness is absent, there is no sense of one's existence or presence, let alone the existence of the world and its inhabitants, or any ideas of bondage and liberation. This is so because the very concept of I is absent. In the dream state, a speck of consciousness begins to stir. One is not yet fully awake, and then in a split second, in that speck of consciousness is created an entire world of mountains and valleys, rivers and lakes, cities and villages with buildings and people of various ages, including the dreamer himself. And what is more important, the dreamer has no control over what the dreamed figures are doing. In other words, a new living world is created in a split second, fabricated out of memory and imagination, merely by a single movement in that speck of consciousness. Imagine, therefore, says Maharaj, the extraordinary power of this consciousness, a mere speck of which can contain and project an entire universe. When the dreamer wakes up, the dream world and the dream figures disappear. What happens when the deep sleep, as also the dream state, are over and consciousness appears again? The immediate sense then is that of existence and presence, not the presence of me, but presence as such. Soon, however, the mind takes over and creates the I, concept and awareness of the body. Maharaj tells us repeatedly that we are so accustomed to thinking of ourselves as bodies, having consciousness, that we find it very difficult to accept or even understand the real position. Actually, it is consciousness which manifests itself in innumerable bodies. It is, therefore, essential to appreciate that birth and death are nothing but the beginning and ending of a stream of moments in consciousness, interpreted as events in space-time. If we can realize this, we shall also realize that we are pure being, awareness, bliss, in our original pristine state. And when in touch with consciousness, we are only the witnessing of and totally apart from the various movements in consciousness. This is an indisputable fact, because obviously we cannot be what we perceive. The perceiver must be different from what he perceives. This is the end of Chapter 2, Consciousness the Only Capital. And my comment here is that Balsekar is now giving us the fundamentals, the definitions, and the first word that comes up, which is very, very important in the philosophy of Nisargadatta Maharaj, is consciousness. He says that there is an absolute reality, which is written with a capital A in this book, which is also pure awareness, which is again written with a capital A, awareness. And when in contact with the world as a body, this is reduced to something, a sense of being, he defines, and calls it consciousness. And then he is giving a metaphor of sun being reflected in dewdrops. So this consciousness is a reflected awareness of the absolute awareness, the absolute with capital A and the awareness with capital A. because human beings have an ego, have a mind, this reflected awareness is taken as a separate individual or the I. And in each individual, the absolute gets reflected as awareness, and thus pure awareness becomes self-awareness or consciousness. So this is the fundamental, and a distinction must be made between these two words, which are awareness and consciousness. So awareness is the absolute existence itself, which he calls simply absolute. And consciousness is that which is being manifested in creatures, in organisms, which we can see right now, right here, as this aliveness, that which is perceiving. So here Balsekar gives a little bit of Sanskrit words, he says consciousness is also Chetna in Sanskrit. So awareness you can translate this as Atman, although Balsekar has not stated that. So usually when I talk about consciousness and awareness, it is exactly reversed. So many of the listeners will get confused whenever I say consciousness. It is the consciousness of the absolute. And whenever I say awareness, I mean a part of the mind, a part of this individual. So the words are reversed here. This should be kept in mind. So awareness is absolute in the vocabulary, in the terminology of Nisargadatta Maharaj, and consciousness is relative, or it is a reflected awareness. And you will know that in this difference, when he says that consciousness is dependent on the body, when he is asking this question, what is the actual substance of this animating consciousness? And he says, obviously it must be physical material, because in absence of the physical form, it cannot survive. Manifested consciousness can exist only as long as its abode, the body, is kept in sound and habitable condition. So this is the significant difference between the words consciousness and awareness. Awareness is absolute, it is unchanging, it is independent of anything at all, while this consciousness is a manifestation of this absolute and appears in a body, appears as an individual. And without body, it is gone. There is no consciousness without body. There is no consciousness without this instrument of the body. And the third point to be kept in the mind is this consciousness changes the states. So he says that we can observe the nature and function of consciousness in our daily routine of sleeping, dreaming, and waking state. In deep sleep, consciousness retires into a state of repose. And in dreaming state, the consciousness is now creating a new body and a new world. And then in waking state, again, it remembers its original body, and the original world comes in view. So this is another point to be kept in mind, that consciousness keeps changing, but awareness does not. Awareness is static. And then he gives an example of how powerful this consciousness is. It can create a world instantly, like in a dream. And he says a mere speck of consciousness can contain and project an entire universe. And now he introduces the word I, when he says that once the consciousness takes up the waking state, then a presence appears, and then slowly there is a concept of the I that is created out of the body and objects around the body. So there is one more idea here, the idea of a separate I, which is created in the mind of this reflected consciousness, which is manifesting through a body. So we have three things now. There is this absolute awareness, which is unchanging. The second is the consciousness, which is manifested awareness, reflected awareness. And the third thing is the concept of I, which is created by the mind, a separate individual. Now the consciousness is entangled with this body and this I appears. So then, and the last point here is kind of very strange, and we don't talk about this point a lot, but it is also a fundamental thing to notice that I'm quoting here, Maharaj tells us repeatedly that we are so accustomed to thinking of ourselves as bodies having consciousness that we find it very difficult to accept or even understand the real position. Actually, it is consciousness which manifests itself in innumerable bodies. So, Maharaj here is actually trying to reverse the view, which is understanding of an ordinary person that I am a body which has a property called consciousness. So just like in Advaita Vedanta, Maharaj is asking you to reverse this view. See if it makes any sense that there is the absolute awareness which is manifested as consciousness because of its interaction with the body, and this produces the illusory concept of I. It is exactly reverse of the usually believed situation that I am a body which appears in a static world, and then there is a consciousness which is produced by the body in the waking state, and there is no mention of awareness. There is nothing which is absolute. So we can now see this as a working of the Maya. Maya is that which reverses the actuality. It will exactly make it upside down. So if we take this other view, the reverse view, that the world appears in awareness, and then the consciousness associated with the body appears as a reflected awareness, as a tiny speck of the awareness, and then the illusion of separate self is created because of this limited body-mind thing which is alive. This idea is created. If we take this point of view, then you will find that just like the dream, in this whole worldly existence becomes an appearance in the awareness. So the birth and death, they are start of a dream and end of a dream. So he says that birth and death are nothing but beginning and ending of a stream of movements in consciousness, interpreted as events in space-time. And if we can realize this, we shall also realize that we are pure being awareness bliss in our original pristine state. And when in touch with consciousness, we are only witnessing of the various movements in consciousness. So if we can entertain this idea that it is actually reverse, that the world appears in consciousness, and that we do not really change, we remain that which on the screen of which the world, the body, and the separate individual appears. This is here also called as being awareness bliss, or in Sanskrit Satchitanand. So it is as it is, only the things appear and disappear on it. So the birth and death also appears as an event, and the life appears as a series of events in space-time. So all of it is an appearance in this being awareness bliss. Now, how to know that this is indeed happening? How to know that my world view was reversed by Maya? Maya is nothing but ignorance. So he says, this is an indisputable fact, because obviously we cannot be what we perceive. The perceiver must be different from what he perceives. So this is the trick. This is the mantra to know that indeed this is the situation. Whatever he is suggesting can be verified like this, that we cannot be that which we can perceive. The perceiver cannot be that which is perceived. It is obviously something different from that which is perceiving. What is that? the world, the objects, they are not I. And so is the body. So is the mind, the mental activities. And so is the idea of I that appears in this mind, the separate individual. All that appears is being perceived, and hence that cannot be the essence of what we are. So what really perceives is consciousness, and that is the essence of what we are. It is very easy to see. That's why he says this is an indisputable fact. It is impossible to deny this, that this is what is happening. The perceiver is different from what he perceives. And now what can be perceived, you can ignore that as your essence. You can put that aside. You can cross it. No, these things which I am perceiving is not I. And that's how we arrive at the consciousness as the essence. So instead of calling the separate individual, the body-mind, as I, we can shift the position of the I to consciousness. I am that which perceives. Or if you want to use more general word, I am that which experiences. Or I am the experiencer, not the experience. So this introspection, very short and sweet introspection, solidifies this view, which is now right side up instead of upside down. And hopefully the relation and meaning of the words, absolute awareness, consciousness, reflected awareness, the individual I, the separate I, and the logic, the sound logic, which establishes the reverse view, is clear to everyone. If this is not clear, then probably the rest of the book will appear as a puzzle. So let us make it sure that we relate these words with our actual experience. This should be our direct experience. So let's go to the chapter 3. In face of death. Visitor. My only son died a few days ago in a car accident, and I find it almost impossible to accept his death with a philosophic fortitude. I know that I am not the first person to suffer such bereavement. I also know that each one of us has to die sometime. I have in my mind sought solace from all the usual ploys by which one consoles oneself and others in such predicaments. And yet I come back to the tragic fact that a cruel fate should deprive my son of everything in the prime of his life. Why? I keep on asking myself, Sir, I cannot get over my grief. Maharaj, after sitting for a minute or so with his eyes closed, it is unavailing and futile to say that I am grieved, because in the absence of the self, that is me as an individual, there are no others. And I see myself mirrored in all of you. Obviously, you have not come to me for mere sympathy, which you surely must have received in abundance from your relatives and friends. Remember, one goes through life year after year, enjoying the usual pleasures and suffering the usual pains, but never once seeing life in its true perspective. And what is the true perspective? It is this: there is no me, nor you. There never could be any such entities. Every man should understand this and have the courage to live his life with this understanding. Do you have this courage, my friend? Or must you wallow in what you call your grief? Visitor, Maharaj, pardon me. I do not fully understand what you have said, but I do feel startled and shaken. You have exposed the core of my being, and what you have said so pithily appears to be the golden key to life. Please elaborate on what you have just said. What exactly is it that I must do? Maharaj, do absolutely nothing. Just see the transient as transient, the unreal as unreal, the false as false, and you will realize your true nature. You have mentioned your grief. Have you ever looked at grief in the face and tried to understand what it really is. To lose somebody or something you have loved dearly is bound to cause sorrow. And since death is total annihilation, with absolute finality, the sorrow caused by it is unmitigated. But even this overwhelming sorrow cannot last long. If you intellectually analyze it, what exactly are you grieving for? Go back to the beginning. Did you and your wife make any agreement with someone that you would have a son, a particular body, and that he would have a particular destiny? Is it not a fact that his conception itself was a chance? That the fetus survived the many hazards in the womb was another matter of chance? That the baby was a boy was yet another chance? In other words, what you call your son was just a chance event, a happening over which you had no control at all at any time. And now that event has come to end. And now that event has come to an end. What exactly are you grieving for? Are you grieving for the few pleasant experiences and the many painful experiences that your son has missed in the years to come? Or are you really and truly grieving for the pleasures and conveniences that you will no longer be able to receive from him? Mind you, all this is from the point of view of the false. Nonetheless, are you with me so far? Visitor, I'm afraid I continue to remain stunned. I certainly follow what you have just said. Only, what did you mean when you said that all this was on the level of the false? Maharaj, now we shall come to the truth. Please understand as truth that you are not an individual, a person. The person that one thinks one is only a product of imagination. And self is the victim of this illusion. Person cannot exist in its own right. It is the self, consciousness, that mistakenly believes that there is a person and is conscious of being it. Change your viewpoint. Don't look at the world as something outside of yourself. See the person you imagine yourself to be as a part of the world. Really a dream world, which you perceive as an appearance in your consciousness. And look at the whole show from the outside. Remember, you are not the mind, which is nothing but the content of consciousness. As long as you identify yourself with the body-mind, you are vulnerable to sorrow and suffering. Outside the mind, there is just being. Not being father or son, this or that. You are beyond space and time, in contact with them only at the point of now and here, but otherwise timeless, spaceless, and invulnerable to any experience. Understand this and grieve no more. Once you realize that there is nothing in this world that you can or need call your own, you will look at it from the outside. As you look at a play on the stage or a movie on the screen, admiring and enjoying, perhaps suffering, but deep down, quite unmoved. So my comment here is that this is yet another dialogue between some visitor and Maharaj. And the visitor, it looks like that he is deeply affected by a death. And this happens in India, that a guru or a master is the last refuge of such people, because everybody around them is actually augmenting the grief, augmenting the sorrow. Everybody's crying and saying sorry. So usually people go to the gurus in order to listen to some spiritual teaching so that they know what to do. So he is coming to Maharaj in the same way. He wants to know why this has happened. Where is his son now, and so on. But instead you will find that Maharaj completely destroys his illusion. Not only he says that there is no you as a person, he says there is no son. There is no such thing as your son. There are no others. He says at one point that in the absence of an individual, there are no others. And I see myself mirrored in all of you. So he says that when this illusion of the separate self or the individual is broken, or when you let it go by shifting your point of view to the consciousness on the screen of which these things appear, then what remains? These distinct entities, they disappear and only consciousness remains. And it is the same reflected consciousness that is here also in the Maharaj also. And therefore I see everyone as my own form. So this is another teaching that we see in this dialogue here. The first point to note is that not only there is no I as a separate individual, there is also no you as a separate individual. There are no others. It is only an appearance. It is only made by the mind. Because I think I am this body and mind, I also think that you are that body and that mind. Although when we look from the point of view of the consciousness, all the body minds are simply appearances on the screen of consciousness, which is unmoved, which is not being affected by what is going on in the bodies and minds. The bodies keep appearing, disappearing, the mind keeps thinking this and that, is changing states, sometimes happy, sometimes pleased, sometimes miserable, sometimes depressed. So when we detach ourselves from these appearances, which is very much possible, it is your direct experience that this can be done, assume the point of view of this consciousness, the screen on which these perceived events, these experiences are appearing. This is how we make a space between that which appears and in which it appears. So there is unity here. There's one screen here. And therefore he says, outside the mind there is just being, not being father or son, this or that. So I am this and I am that, I am father, I am son. These are all assumptions in the mind. They come with the ignorance of being a person, and ignorance of taking the relations of the body as my relations. What is the product of this ignorance? Obviously, suffering. So first step is intellectually discarding this. Second is to shift to the being, not to the appearance. So he is using terminology here which we may find a little bit confusing. He says, look at the whole show from the outside. Now, we should not confuse the word outside with something outside of this world, something outside of this mind-body. No. He says, stand aside from this show that is happening, that is outside. And when you are inside the show, when you are a character in the show, then you are dragged along with what is happening. That is suffering. Even if the show is very happy show, it is a pleasure. Pleasure is also suffering because no freedom there. So the word outside here, according to my interpretation, and probably this is being used by Balsekar, probably there is another word used by Maharaj, but it is good enough. So you can adopt this terminology for now, that standing at the point of view of consciousness is standing outside the show, not outside some imagined universe or something, or imagined dimension. So in Advait, we reverse this word and we say it is happening inside. We use exactly opposite word. We say that the whole show is happening inside us, which is the same thing. We should drop the metaphors, we should drop the language and see that there is this appearance which appears in consciousness. That's all. To explain it, to make a distinction, we can use such words as outside, inside, screen, and movie. So he actually is giving us a metaphor of the screen also. He says, once you realize that there is nothing in this world that you can call or need call your own, you will look at it from the outside. As you look at a play on the stage or a movie on the screen, admiring and enjoying, perhaps suffering, but deep down, quiet, unmoved, So just like the screen remains unchanged while the movie is being played on it, and the movie has all the content, you see, ups and downs, the bright and dark, good and evil, but the screen is simply showing it. It's unmoved. So although taking this point of view of the screen is not going to stop the movie, it brings about the needed sanity. This distinction, which happens in the intellect, brings about this peace of mind while everything is happening, while the appearances are appearing. The mind is not dragged around by the situations that it is. Although there will be suffering, there will be enjoyment, there will be all kinds of adventures, but there is a deeper understanding here that, this is all appearance, this is all a play. And so the individuated consciousness remains unmoved, although it is incorrect to say that it becomes like this. It is already like this. The consciousness is already unmoved. It is not affected by what it is looking at. The only thing that happens by shifting this point of view is that a knowledge appears in the mind that this is indeed so. So we are shown that which actually is, and we can now discard that we assumed. So that's what he is calling as truth. Now we shall come to the truth. So this is a little bit of explanation of what I could understand. And yes, the language is very, very simple and sometimes not that accurate. Like at one place he says, change your viewpoint. Don't look at the world as something outside of yourself. And then he says, then look the whole show from the outside. So it is not really precise language, but it's good enough to give you the essential of what is being said. So this is all for today, and in the next reading we'll continue with the next chapter. Thank you for listening.
Pure experiences.
You were listening to Pure Experiences by Tharun Pradhan.